Good evening. It's good to have you with us today. It's nice to be back in the house of the Lord. And I hope that some of the remarks tonight will be encouraging to you and that it will be good for you to have been here. I want to preach about a phrase that is found in Haggai chapter 2 and verse 4. Haggai chapter 2 and verse 4. You know, Haggai was one of what we call the minor prophets. And along about 2,530 some odd years ago, Cyrus, king of Persia, issued a decree and basically said, go home if you want to, just go on. And he gave them provisions and monies, and to the Jews, he returned their articles of the temple and said, go back to Jerusalem and build your temple. And so a handful out of the millions that had been killed in the previous war and had endured 70 years of captivity, a new generation primarily, a few leftovers, but a new generation primarily made their way back to Jerusalem. And in Haggai, in the book of Ezra, rather, around the 4th and 5th chapter, we see them laying the foundation of the temple. And I don't know if it looked like that or not, but we know that it was not as grandiose, as glorious as the temple of Solomon. And some people, including maybe Haggai, remembered that. And so there was weeping and cheering. Some people were weeping maybe because the foundation of the temple was being poured and the temple was going to be rebuilt. Maybe some were weeping because they remembered the former glory of Solomon's temple and saw that this one was not going to be anywhere near as glorious. But nevertheless, they started the work. They started the work. They poured the foundations of the temple and started to build back the house of God. And then something happened that happens to all of us occasionally. They stopped. They quit. And Ezra tells us there were a variety of reasons. There was some opposition and there was some legalese and wrangling and things like that. And nevertheless, they quit the work. And for 16 years, all that grew in that plot of ground up on the hill of Zion were weeds. And then Haggai and Zechariah said this, who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? But now take courage, Zerubbabel. Take courage, Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and all of you people of the land. Take courage, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. Haggai says, be courageous, be strong, and get back to the work. This word, courageous, of course, means to be valiant, be hardened, to withstand opposition. And so what I want to do this evening is take a look at a few things in which we need to be courageous. And then we're going to loop back to this story of Haggai. You know, the Bible teaches us to be strong in our faith. In Romans chapter 4 and verse 20 and 21, the apostle says, with respect to the promise of God, he, Abraham, the father of the faithful, did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God and being fully assured that what God had promised, he was able also to perform. We need to be strong in our faith. You know, sometimes just believing in today's world requires courage because of the opposition that we face. But, you know, I'm really talking not about just believing mentally, but I'm talking about an active faith. A faith that believes and trusts and then does what God asks of us, and does not cower in fear because of opposition or even because of persecution. The Bible teaches us that we need to believe like Abraham believed, that God will do what he promises. When God promises it, he will do it. And so when God says to us, seek me first. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and then I will add all these things to you. Do you believe that? Do you believe it? Yes, I believe it. But let me tell you something. If you're young, and if you're older, you know this already, but when you're young, I'm going to tell you right now that faith is going to be tested. It is going to be tested because you're going to be challenged in your career, in your life, with confronting that faith and saying, no, it really doesn't matter. Really, what my boss wants is what matters. What the corporate line is what matters. I know I've been faced with that. I've not only been faced with that when I worked for other people, but you know what? The devil doesn't stop there. I've been faced with that when I worked for myself. And you have your own ethical standards, both professionally and godly, that you have to live up to. Yet I've been challenged, and I had no boss. I was my boss. But yet I was still faced with that kind of a challenge. Do we believe in what God promised? Do we believe what God said in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 8, that godliness holds a better life? That God's promises hold the promise of not only a better life today, but the better life for tomorrow and hereafter? Do we believe in what God said in Isaiah 55 and verse 11, that my word will not return unto me void, but it will accomplish the purposes for which I intend? Do we believe that? I hope we believe that. Do we believe in what Jesus said? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Where I am, you shall also be. Do we believe that? It's interesting that Jesus prefaced those remarks in John 14 with, let not your heart be troubled. There's a lot of reasons for us to be troubled. A lot of conflicts, a lot of persecutions, a lot of doubts that the devil sows within our lives. But if we have faith, and if we're strong in faith, we will believe that God will do what he promises. You know, the Bible also tells us to be strong in grace. To be strong in the grace of God. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 1, he says, therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. God's grace has been revealed to us, and we need to be strong in it. We need to believe that God's grace is revealed, and we are in his grace. You know, when we talk about the grace of God, I like to think of the story of Noah, because Noah is someone who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now let's think about that for just a second, shall we? What does that mean? Noah found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. You mean he was walking along one day on the road, and there was a bill that said God's grace, and he picked it up off the road. Much like we find pennies and quarters on the road and we put them in our pocket, right? Is that the way you found grace? No, that's not the way you found grace. Follow Ralph's rules. Read the next verse. Here's what the next verse says. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. I tell you what, if you walk with God, and if you are blameless in your time, you're going to find grace in the eyes of God. you're going to find favor. God's favor, His grace, is going to shine on you. You know, it's interesting that in the Gospel of Luke, he opens up with the story of Elizabeth and Zacharias, John the Baptist's parents. And what is told to us about those two people is that they were blameless. They were righteous in the eyes of the Lord. And so God appeared to them. The archangel Michael appeared to them, and he told them that you're going to have a son, and he's going to prepare the way for the Messiah. Why did God choose them? Why did God choose Zacharias and Elizabeth? Because they walked with God. So they found favor in God's eyes. If you want to have grace and be strong in the grace, walk with God. Walk with God and be blameless with God. Here's what the apostle says in Titus 2 about it. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires, and to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in this present age. You know, the doctrine of grace in the New Testament is about as far away from ecumenicism as you can possibly get. Really. You know, the gospel of God's grace in the Old and the New Testament, for that matter, is not that God's going to save everybody regardless of what they do. No. God's grace is going to save you because of what you have done. You have reached out to God. You have walked with God. You have sought after God. Think of the prayer of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Remember that story? Cornelius was a pious Gentile. He sought after God. And he prayed to God continuously. And the angel of God appeared to him and said, Cornelius, your prayers have been heard. What prayers? What were Cornelius' prayers? Well, Cornelius' prayers is, I want to be right with you, the Lord. Lord, I want to be right with you. Show me the way. And so, we know that because the angel told Cornelius what the answer to his prayers were. Send for Peter at Joppa, and he is going to come down to you and tell you words by which you will be saved. And he did. Peter did. And Cornelius was saved and became the first Gentile convert to the gospel. Cornelius, Noah, Zacharias, Elizabeth, these people found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Why? Because they were seeking after the things of God and not the things of the world. Be strong. Let's be strong in our doctrine. Here's what Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 4. Take pains with these things. Pains? Pains? Sometimes I take pains when I try to get my lessons up. Ryan, you probably do too, right? It's painful. I think I've told some of these college kids, the degree to which you succeed in college is going to equal the pain that you feel in your rear end because you've had to hit the books a lot, right? Take pains. Struggle with these things. Take pains with things. Be absorbed in them so that your progress will be evident to all. Pay close attention to yourself and your teaching. Look at what Paul says here. He doesn't say, doctrine doesn't matter, teaching doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what you believe. It's who you believe, not what you believe. All those slang, those expressions are wrong. They are nonsense. They are not biblical. It is important what you believe. Vitally important. Pay attention to it. Why? Persevere in these things. Why? For as you do this, you will ensure salvation both for yourself and for those who hear you. Being strong in doctrine, being strong in teaching. Why? Jesus said in John 8:32, it's the truth that sets us free. We need to learn it. We need to be convicted in it. We need to be teaching it, and then we need to be teaching it to others. Let's be strong in building. You know, Ryan talked about the sentence of our life this morning, the sentence that describes our life. And he talked about building a life, right? Building a life that is worthy of God's calling. It was a great lesson based on Acts 13 and Paul's description of David's life. When I come back to Zerubbabel and to the story of Haggai. Haggai said to them, take courage. You know, take courage. I mean, they were just building a building, right? What is there to take courage in when you're building a building? Well, I happen to have built a few buildings, and I know it takes courage. How about machines, Nolan? Does it take courage to build some machines and keep them running, maintained? Yeah, you bet it does. You know what? It takes courage in building anything that's worthwhile. You know what? Now, if all you want is a cardboard shack leaned up against the side of an underpass, it doesn't take much time or courage to do that. But if you're going to build anything that's going to withstand the elements, if you're going to build anything that you can really live in and build a life in, it's going to take courage. To Solomon, in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 10, David said to his son in preparation for building the great temple, be courageous and act. It's not enough to be courageous, not enough to have faith. Now you've got to act. You know, you run into people sometimes that procrastinate, right? They want to do something, but they just can't get to it. They don't want to start, right? They don't want to start. For some reason, they procrastinate. But then there are some people that start, like these people did in Haggai's day. They start, but never finish, right? They never act to finish. That's what Haggai was encouraging his generation to do. Well, Solomon, and the same thing that David was encouraging Solomon to do. Be courageous and act. In that same chapter, in verse 20, David tells Solomon, be strong and courageous to build the temple. It was going to take 14 years to build that entire complex. You realize that? 14 years. 7 years to build the temple and 7 more years to build the surrounding buildings. Long time. Big project. To Joshua, God says to Joshua as he is going into the land of Canaan to assume the mantle of the great prophet Moses, right? And he's going to lead God's people to conquer the land of milk and honey, the promised land, the land that God had promised the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And at the very beginning of it, in chapter 1 of Joshua, he says, be strong and courageous. The Lord is with you. Why did he have to be strong and courageous? God had given him the land. When they walked through the Jordan River, you know, the river just opened up, you know, like the Red Sea had done. You remember that story? That I've given you this land. But you know what you've got to kind of read the subtitles to figure this out. You know how long it took them to conquer the land? It took 7 years. And they had to fight. God said, I've given you the land. But they still had to march around the Jordan. They still had to march around the city of Jericho, didn't they? And they still had to defeat the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And they still had to drive out the inhabitants of the land, which we learn later, of course, that not all of them did. Right? That's why they needed to be strong. That's why they needed to be courageous. That's why they needed to have faith that the Lord was with them. You know, finally, we are building something too. We're building something. We're building a life. Some of you are just starting out in your lives. You're graduating high school. You're going to college. You're getting ready to get married. Wonderful. You're building a life. You're building a home. Be strong and courageous. The Lord is with you. You're doing the right things. Keep on that path. As a collective body of God's people here, as a church, we're doing something. We're building something. We are building the house of God. We are building a church. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So we need to be strong and courageous because we are building a church, the house of God, the temple of God. Well, be strong. Be strong and courageous. Be strong in faith. Be strong in grace. Be strong in our doctrine. Be strong in our building. There's one here tonight that needs to make their life right with God because God's grace has been revealed to you and you know that you need to do something about that. And we offer you this opportunity tonight to be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins, to become a child of God. Or if you've fallen away from Him and you need to make your life right, then we offer you that opportunity to come forward tonight as well. Whatever your need may be, come forward. We're always standing while we sing.